Alright, so for today's episode, this is going to be part 2 of the Wyoming mule deer hunt planning. So it's going to go over the kind of online scouting hunt planning aspects of this, so looking at terrain features and looking at possible migrations and private and public land and access to public land and that sort of thing online ahead of the hunt. And then this episode is also going to deal with the actual on-the-ground decisions that I made while hunting to choose to either hunt an area longer or to stop hunting a certain area after a certain point in time and move to different areas. So I'm going to go over a lot of the different terrain features in this one. There's going to be a lot of maps that I illustrate. I don't like to use Google Maps or anything like that because I want to avoid any kind of copyright issues. So this episode in particular is going to feature a lot of terrain maps and on-the-ground maps made by yours truly. So it's going to have a lot of that sort of thing, and then it's going to kind of finish off with a narration of the decisions I made in the hunt and how the hunt actually went itself. So here is part 2 of my Wyoming mule deer hunt planning. Alright, so I'm going to kick this off by going through my online scouting method that I decided to use for Unit 122. And if you recall from the previous episode, Unit 122 had November season dates. So the season dates for this unit start up here. Unit 122 was November 1st through, I believe it was the 10th. Okay, so this here is going to be an example of the terrain in 122. So what this yellow represents is kind of the color that you see for 122 when you're looking on Google Earth, Google Maps. So let me fill in some more details here. Let's add a road. So say this is pretty much how the unit looked here. There's it's a larger road going through the bottom of the unit here. Alright. And let's add in some elevation lines. So you guys have seen these lines on many different maps before. These are just kind of symbolizing the topography in the unit. So this unit had one area that was much higher country than the others. I think that was McCullough Peak. So that's kind of what I'm symbolizing now. Had a lot of drainages going off this side here, and this stuff here. It's a little smoother terrain, some changes in elevation, but overall less drastic changes than the changes in elevation you see coming off this peak. So you see a lot of different drainages going this way, and smooth the terrain out to the east side of this unit. Now, let's see if we can, let me try and zoom in here. Okay, so we've zoomed in on this McCullough Peak area. The reason I zoomed in on this area was when I was looking on Google Maps, what I noticed was that there was a lot of sagebrush in these drainages. So let's use this to kind of symbolize the sagebrush. So in a lot of these drainages, you'd see this sort of stuff coming off. This is pretty much what it looked like on Google Maps. A lot of these drainages, and some of the, I think it was the north side of the slope that had kind of sagebrush on it. So let me try and just really quick fill in for a lot of these drainages, kind of going down from the hill. So the top of the hill being here, we're looking at the drainages in between. Some of the hillsides and the shadier portion had some sagebrush in as well. Some of the deeper drainages, wherever water could concentrate, there's good amounts of sagebrush. What I've noticed in Nevada too is you see a lot of the dried up riverbeds, even in super dry desolate units in Nevada that have almost no water, no deer, almost no wildlife outside of coyotes and jackrabbits. In those dried up riverbeds, you will see pretty big stands of sagebrush. So you'll see them in a lot of low elevation areas that can collect water. But this is kind of what it looks like looking on Google Maps. So if you filled up Google Maps of this area around McCullough Peaks, you'd see a lot of this the sagebrush in those drainages. So what that is indicative of, seeing all this sagebrush, whereas over here it was pretty barren, not a lot of not a lot of plants that mule deer could feed on, maybe some dried up grasses and cactuses. But this was where most of the sagebrush was. And this is kind of hinting that it might be good winter range for mule deer. Important thing about this is, as it's a November season, that's kind of getting into where mule deer are going to be concentrated more on their winter ranges. So seeing this sagebrush was pretty indicative of this might be good wintering area for mule deer. The second thing that kind of pushed us even more in the direction of looking at this area was that that winter of 2018 was a pretty good winter. We had an early snowfall. It actually fell around this area just east of Yellowstone in October. So by the time November rolled around, there had been quite a few good snowfalls, pushing them out of the higher elevations, pretty much pushing them out of the summer ranges for good, and concentrating them more onto this winter range. There still wasn't a lot of deer in this unit because it's still more desolate than other areas that might have better winter range habitat. But there was enough sagebrush here to support some mule deer migrating to it. Another thing we did find out was that there is a U.S. Department of Agriculture Forest Service map. And what the map is titled is, you can actually look it up on Google Images, but it's titled Mule Deer Habitat of the Western United States. And it will show you, using different colors, their migration routes, their summer ranges, and their winter ranges. And if you zoom in on this map to this area, roughly east of Cody and east of Yellowstone, you'll see that this area is pretty much listed by the Forest Service as being good mule deer habitat for the winter range. So that was really what sealed the deal for us. There was the three things. There was the fact that we had a good early winter that pushed them down into this lower elevation winter range terrain. We saw a lot of the sagebrush and the forage that they would need to survive here during the winter. And then third, we saw that the Forest Service was indeed confirming that this was good mule deer winter range. Difficult thing with this this area 122 that I'm going to note, because it's pretty important, is if you look through Wyoming Department of Fish and Game's hunt planner, you'll see for each unit some of them will have an asterisk. And what that asterisk will mean is that there's difficult public access to that unit. And this unit had that asterisk. It's interesting though, because this road that runs throughout the unit links up perfectly with the BLM land. I think let me draw out what the private land looked like. There was actually a little bit of private land kind of coming up through here. So right in here was all the private land kind of blocking access directly up to there, but you could hike around it, and there was two tracks that went directly onto the BLM land here. We'll say there was roads kind of going up this way through to access the rest of the unit. So there was decent access to the public land. You could certainly jump right off the highway and then hike into it. The reason they said that this unit had difficult public access is because most of the mule deer in this unit aren't hanging out on this public land area. Most of the mule deer were hanging out, let's draw it in green. Let's say right here is some private cropland. Draw this in green right here. Hopefully this shows up. Let me see if I can hit that with the paint bucket. Yeah, so this symbolizes private cropland. So what Wyoming's Department of Fish and Game figured out and kind of stated for this unit was that most of the deer were actually hanging out here in the private cropland. The ratio is probably something like 20 to 1, 10 to 1, but in any case, there's exponentially more mule deer in this unit on these private croplands outside of the public BLM land. There's very few mule deer on the public BLM within this unit. In fact, the mule deer that was shot here, the 4x4, that the other individual I was hunting, kind of in the same party with, shot, was the only mule deer they saw the entire time they were hunting. So that's the method we used to go about scouting for the unit. We found good range, good forage for where they would be that time of year, found easy enough ways to access that public land, and then kind of planned around the private land, planned around where a lot of the mule deer would be this time of year, even though we couldn't access these areas, and put our best effort into where we thought they would be. And it paid off because they shot a fairly decent, for their first time mule deer hunting, 4x4. Alright, so from there I'm going to jump into what I did to scout my area that I hunted, which was to the south of there, Unit 127. Alright, so I'm going to use the same background to kind of symbolize 127, and I'm going to start off once again by adding some topography to this. So the difficult thing about 127 that made it differ greatly from 122 was that there was a lot more rugged elevations within this unit. Instead of in 122 where there was a big kind of a peak and then the drainages centered around it. 127 looked something more like, we'll say like this. So this is going to symbolize a ridge line. And let's add another ridge line here on the south side. There's actually another ridge line here. So there was ridge lines running all throughout this entire unit. So these are our ridge lines. Let's add some peaks in here. There's peaks in here. There's another ridge line that goes in here. And each one of these ridge lines had a lot of drainages coming off of it. So instead of being centered around one peak, there was a lot of different varying elevations here. A lot of different changes in elevations within this unit. There was pretty decent road access throughout the entire thing. So this is kind of what the elevation in this unit looked like. Like I said, a lot of very rapid changes in elevation. This pretty much qualified as more of a Badlands unit versus kind of 122 is more of a single point of elevation with some drainages coming off of it. And then other than that, that unit is pretty much flat. But for the most part, 127, let me actually add what it kind of looks like. So this is sort of the boundary for the unit here. 127 is sort of a triangle-shaped unit. So that's pretty much what that looked like, and then Thermopolis would be down there. So this is more of what that unit looked like. But a couple things I noted was that there were some main roads that went through the unit. So one of the main roads went through right here. There was a lot of roads coming up through here, accessing these northern portions. There was quite a few roads coming down through here, here, coming through the center. There was a huge road that kind of bisected this portion here. And this looked like it was kind of the main access. So I figured, it being a general season unit, I would want to stay away from this main access road here. Because I figured this whole area, the mule deer would get pushed away from it and kind of get pushed into some of the more rugged, less accessible surrounding terrain. So the area I decided to hit up first was this portion here to the north. Because this was the most rugged out of all the ridge lines in the entire unit. There was no roads that were able to go through this. This was super rapid changes in elevation. I want to say it went up about 2,000 feet within a half mile here. So we have this very profound ridge line here with a lot of different drainages. And when I looked on Google Earth, it was kind of the same situation as it was around that McCullough Peak area. A lot of these drainages, you could tell on Google Earth, they contained this sort of sagebrush looking stuff. Very apparent when you look on Google Earth. I would recommend playing around with Google Earth on this unit. Pull up Google Earth, zoom in on some of these drainages that you see, and you'll see exactly what I mean. There'll be sagebrush kind of scattered throughout here. The difficult thing around this unit that made it harder to scout than Unit 122 was that there was sagebrush in a lot more places. What made 122 kind of easy for us scouting wise was there was one area that had almost all the sagebrush in the entire unit. And it made it super easy to concentrate around that area and then locate the mule deer in that area. Problem was in 127, not only did you have sagebrush in these drainages of these ridge lines that I'm illustrating, but you actually had quite large swathes of sage throughout a lot of the basins too, because it was a little bit higher elevation as a baseline, and that made it that gave it more moisture, and there was a lot more sagebrush hanging out sort of everywhere within this unit. You'd see a lot of sagebrush in the flats. Because of that too, I actually saw a lot of antelope running around through the flats of this unit as well. But that's sort of what this unit looked like. So what I did instead of just looking for the sagebrush was I looked for areas that were more isolated and far away from people. And that was kind of the plan I stuck with. I basically decided on a few areas that I wanted to hit up because this area was further away from the roads. And then this area in here, once you get off of this section and get down to this kind of this southern portion in here, this section in here was somewhat isolated from roads as long as you got away from this over here. As long as you got away from this, you got deeper into here, away from some of this basin here, into some of the drainages of this particular ridgeline here, I got further away from roads. So this was an area I wanted to hit up. And this was an area I wanted to hit up when I did my actual hunting within the unit. So I kind of prioritized my areas for this unit based on how far away from the roads they were. Alright, so now I'm really going to briefly go over how the actual hunt went and how I changed my strategy as I learned more and more about the unit and I spent more time in that unit. So like I said, I started out on that ridgeline to the north side of the unit, that steepest ridgeline that I could find. So I'm going to try my best to do sort of a 3D drawing of that ridgeline. So let's pretend that this is the ridgeline, rising up from the lower elevation, the flats within the unit. So this is kind of what that ridge looks like if you're looking at it. So pretend you're, let's say the road, I think the road was right about here. So the road's right here, and you're driving on the road approaching this ridgeline. It has all its different drainages running down throughout this ridgeline here. And in those drainages is where I'm seeing a lot of the sagebrush. So let's add some sagebrush down in these drainages here. And since this unit looked like it got pretty good moisture, there's actually kind of sagebrush, a smattering of sagebrush all across the various elevations within most of these ridge lines out here. Yeah, they were concentrated pretty heavily in the drainages, but there was decent amounts of sagebrush everywhere. In addition to the sagebrush, there was quite a bit of junipers within this particular ridgeline that I was hunting at first. They weren't super dense to the point where they were difficult to glass through, but there was at least some junipers. That's what I'm kind of trying to illustrate right now, scattered across this ridgeline. So the first day I was hunting out here, there was still some snow left over. It snowed about, I think it was 2 days before I got there was the bulk of the snow. The night that I was driving out from there, because I flew into Casper and then I drove out to Thermopolis. So the night that I was driving out here, it was actually snowing pretty heavy, and the roads were kind of difficult. There was quite a few cars that were run off the road. So it was a decent snowfall. So when I got out to here, the first day, I had a scouting day, and then I planned on doing 5 days of hunting. So the first scouting day, I was through this unit, there was still decent snow, and I saw a couple sets of fresh tracks. I think it was about 2 sets of fresh tracks, but I didn't see any deer that first day I was scouting. And actually, that first day of hunting, I didn't see any deer there the entire time as well. And I pretty much, the problem was, I was able to cover this entire ridgeline pretty well. It wasn't very long, it was probably only about 5 or so miles long for the entire ridgeline. So I felt like I covered the entire thing relatively well, and I didn't see any real evidence of there being a lot of mule deer there. I saw, I think, 2 individual shed antlers, but they were really old, and it wasn't a good indicator of any kind of recent activity because I didn't know if those were sheds from how long ago those sheds were there from, and I didn't know if those were there because mule deer were going to migrate here later in the year as more snow forced them down into there, and I just didn't have an overall good feeling about the number of mule deer within this ridgeline. So what I then decided to do was I decided to move locations. The first day of season when I was out here, I noticed that there were a lot of people shooting actually down on one of the other ridgelines to the south of me. That made sense for a couple reasons. It made sense because there was a lot of big open sagebrush basins within that portion of the unit, and they were kind of hidden around various ridgelines like this. There were clusters of ridgelines around those basins. In addition to that, that's kind of previously in the direction of where I said before that main road accessing the unit was. So I figured a lot of hunters were using that main road to the south to access a lot of the big basins and ridgelines within the center of the unit, and were hunting there. So as it progressed from the weekend into the first part of the week, usually what happens is the resident hunting pressure calms down and kind of subsides for the most part because they're hunting during the weekends. They're not necessarily taking time off from work to hunt this general season unit that Wyoming residents get over the counter. So the hunting pressure calmed down a lot during the weekday, and I decided to pick up and move my location. Alright, so this is where I ended up packing up and moving to. This is that main road that I told you kind of bisected the southern portion of the unit, and this was the main road that people were using, the resident hunters were using to access the unit. Some of them were road hunting off it, so they parked their car and then they glass up into the hills here. I noticed a lot of people on the weekends driving back and forth on here and glassing into various spots. So what I decided to do to still get away from that road was I headed down south into the southern portion of this unit here. So I think I parked somewhere around here, and I got off and I hiked until I was about 1.5 miles, 2 miles away from the road, and then I camped out here. Actually, during the hike, as I was hiking in, I had everything in my pack because I was backpacking into this spot again. So I had my rifle in the scabbard, the tent, the sleeping bag, the everything in the backpack. I bumped, I think it was one of the bigger forkhorn bucks that I ended up seeing in the area, right about here. So let's do that in red, because that's pretty important. That was pretty important, seeing the first buck that I saw in the unit. So I bumped the first buck there. And let's add the sagebrush, give it a little more character. So these big, I want to do that with the crayon. But the big sage basins within this unit were on relatively flat terrain. There was huge sage basins right around here. And that first buck that I bounced right here, was hanging out in some of these big sage basins in the rolling hills terrain. Now, obviously, like I said before, there's smatterings of sagebrush kind of throughout the entire unit. A lot of it in these drainages from on the hillsides of the bigger ridge lines. A lot of it in the basins. But there's a smattering of sagebrush kind of throughout this entire unit. A little bit up on this ridge line as well. Here. And kind of even getting down into the lower sections by this road here. But I wasn't able to take any shots at that buck because once I bumped him, he kind of took off here and then disappeared into whatever cover he could find within this ridge line. And since I didn't have my rifle out, I wasn't able to take a shot. There was never a good opportunity. So that buck kind of headed off in that direction. This is what kind of told me I had found an area with more deer. Not only did I see this buck and bump him further into the drainages, but before, when I was way on the northern side of the unit, up here, this is where I heard most of the shots from opening day happening. So a lot of the residents that were doing road hunting around here, or maybe even hiking into here or here, were taking a decent number of shots at the deer. So this is where they had kind of found the core of their range to be, and I found that to be true after I found this buck here. After that day, that was day 3 total, because that was my second day of hunting, day 3 if you include the scouting. The 2 days after that I spent in this unit, I went down here and glassed off this ridge line, and then I did a lot of hiking around here, covered these drainages, and covered this ridge line here. I think this is what I did last, was I covered this set of ridge lines here last. I did this side over here and glassed the hills on this side because right over here was where a lot of the private land was. So the south side of the unit, it turns from public to private. There was a lot of cropland there. This was where I noticed there was a lot of deer feeding in the cropland, and it looked like it was pretty good numbers of mule deer as well. It's right down here, cropland. Down here, cropland. Didn't look like there was that many whitetails actually, which surprised me. I would have expected more whitetails for the cropland, but there was a good number of mule deer feeding here. When I went down on this side, I was hoping to catch them kind of coming off the cropland, or going back and forth early in the morning or late at night to and from the cropland and the foothills here. But I didn't actually end up seeing any of that happening. A lot of the deer just stayed on the cropland and fed there. After I finished hiking around this area and looking at the cropland, I went up to the side here, because this was the last area of cover that I hadn't explored really well, and I figured it's the direction I bumped that buck in. Maybe this is good security cover for mule deer as well. This was the only area that I kind of encountered really thick, really quite thick juniper cover, especially on the north side of this ridge line. So I figured at one point in time this was probably really good bedding habitat for bucks, but there was no way to really glass into it, and when I still hunted through it, no dice. There was no deer that I noticed bedded in there. So that brought me to the close of the 4th day of my hunt. So what I did on the 5th day of my hunt was I pretty much threw all my effort at this ridge line here. And it was the largest ridge line, individual ridge line on the southern end of this unit, and I figured it could have the best habitat for the deer there. So what I did that last morning was, that last night I packed up from my campsite here, hiked back to the road, and then early that morning before dawn, I made my way up into this ridge line here. I didn't know a lot about this ridge line because I hadn't explored it yet, but as I was hiking up, so before dawn, as I was hiking up here, I think it was roughly here. Let me do another red X, because this is when I saw the next deer. It was another forky buck. It was like every buck I was encountering in this unit was a 50 to 70 inch forky buck. But it was before legal shooting light, and I actually got within about 50 yards of him, and I decided I was going to wait here until legal shooting light. But he actually made his way off. I think he headed in this direction before legal shooting light, and I waited here because I didn't want to put too much pressure on him. So then when legal shooting light hit, I kind of went around this way and pursued him throughout the unit, or tried to find him or where he went here. And as I kind of got to the top of this ridgeline, what I learned was that a lot of this slope to the north had decent, dense juniper cover in the drainages. So I figured this was a lot of the cover that the mule deer had used to escape after that opening weekend pressure. So a lot of the mule deer had stayed around this cover, but since it was so early in the morning, there had been that buck outside of the cover this way. So as I was hiking around in this unit here, I ended up running into, not that buck again, but a group of 5 does. I think they're right about here. It's a group of does right about here, sort of thing. And those obviously weren't what I was looking for. I was looking for bucks. It was a good sign, but it wasn't quite what I needed it to be, and this was the last day of the hunt. So I started hiking back here, and I figured I would go deeper into this section here. But as I was hiking here, I just completely on hunch, I can't tell you why I did it, but it might have had something to do with the fact that this buck that I had bumped, I noticed that he went this way into the unit. So I decided instead of going this way, I would hike along this kind of flat part of the ridge line, sort of by the top, and hike this way and see what was down here. And as I was doing that, I eventually, probably right about this portion here, ran into the group of 5 bucks here. And from that group, that's where I harvested the 1 buck. So what I learned about this unit was it was kind of ironic because I ended up shooting this buck less than a mile away from the road, probably right about here. But I think the thing that made that possible was that this area had relatively decent cover, and I was out there relatively early in the morning when they were still on this open part feeding, and they just were not at the point where they were all running back into the pines, not just to cover from people, but to get away from the sun midday. So I was there early enough in the morning where they were still out in the open. And I think the reason they were there too was, like I said, a lot of the resident hunting pressure had subsided by the point in time I was hunting there. So residents weren't cruising this road back and forth as heavily as they were that first opening weekend. So I guess as the people started leaving this road more, the deer started to come back out and come closer to the road more. Honestly, I think that buck that I shot was probably visible from this stretch of road right here. You probably could have glassed into this drainage and actually shot it. But now, whether or not that would have been true opening day and that opening weekend, probably not. They might have been initially, but if they were shot at, they probably would have dove into this timber here and hid there for a few days at least. And it looks like they just popped out when I was hunting there. I think that was Friday. I was actually hunting there, so much later in the week after that opening weekend pressure had subsided. So that's how my hunt went. That's how I decided to go about scouting, and that's how I changed my plan with the different information that I was taking in as I was scouting and hunting and learning about this unit here. So that's how I made my first mule deer hunt happen, from all the way from applying for the point, not applying for the points, but applying for the unit, drawing for the unit, figuring out which area I was going to hunt, what they were going to be doing during that season. I had a lot of help because in 2018, that winter was a pretty heavy early winter, and basically what that did was it pushed a lot of the deer off the high elevations by Yellowstone and the bighorns into these lower elevation units that I hunted that year. So 2018 was a good year to be hunting this region, Region X. Like I said before, I don't necessarily recommend Region X. I don't recommend against it, but there's better units for non-residents. This area gets hit by a lot of the residents, and like I said, the trophy quality is really poor. I never saw anything above a fork horn the entire time I was hunting this unit, and I saw exclusively fork horns, probably about 6 fork horn bucks. So gets a lot of pressure. Its trophy quality is pretty poor, and you could have a better hunt in some place like Idaho, say, Montana, even Washington, or a lot of those leftover tags in Colorado are going to just have more deer than this unit has, and better quality deer at that too. This is not only is it a general season unit, but it is a very sparse population unit, and I don't necessarily recommend hunting Region X, but if for whatever reason it's something you really want to do, go ahead and do it, but I don't want to ruin it for the residents that live in Thermopolis or Cody and like hunting this area. And honestly, it's a lot of work hunting this area because the deer population is very sparse. So don't expect it to be in any way easy in this unit. And especially if you get a winter that's not so heavy, there might not be very many deer in this unit at all. I could have just gotten very lucky. But thank you for tuning in. I hope you learned a lot from this. Let me know in the comments section if you have any questions. But again, thanks for being here.